Hey everybody, welcome back to this Twine tutorial series, and this video is about variables and how you can use them in Twine. So just to begin with, I'm just going to talk about what is a variable. I'm also going to cover if statements and functions, but I think I'll probably do those in a separate video. We'll just talk about variables in this one. So what a variable is something in a game that has a value that can change. It's basically something that the game needs to remember and possibly make alterations to. So there's a few examples there. So something like the player's HP. So they're going to have a starting HP, say 100, and then if they get hit by a bullet or something like that, it's going to reduce that number by, let's say, 10 or something like that. Same with score. They're going to start with a value of 0 at the beginning of the game, and then as they progress through the game, earning points, that number is going to increase in value. Other things like the currently selected weapon, the speed, the character's name. So say, for example, you've got a game where you can input the name of your main character, as you can in a lot of games, then that would be stored as a variable because it's something that the game needs to remember, and then later on in the game it can reference that variable. Other things like currency. Currency is value that the game needs to remember, and the game can add and subtract from if the player spends money or earns money. You've also got stats like your attack and defense. Lots of games have things like this that are variables that all interact with each other in different ways. There are different types of variable to know about. The main ones are for Twine are mainly Booleans, integers. I think we can use floats as well, but and strings. So what these are is a Boolean is basically a true or false value. So in the game, this variable is only one of two different states. So an example of that could be a variable which is called player is alive. So maybe you need to check whether the player is alive or not before moving to the game over screen or something like that. So you'd be like, if at the start of the game, obviously player is alive would equal to true, but if the player's HP went below 0, then player is alive would be equal to false. Integer. An integer is just a whole number, so it's basically a number that doesn't have a decimal point after it. A float is a number with a decimal point after it, so like these examples, 0.7, 3.142. And a string is a variable containing text. So for example, when we talked about the player's name being input into the game by the player and saved, that would save that as a string variable because it is text that it needs to remember. The reason it has these differences is because obviously in the game you can't like add 10 onto a string variable, so they're all stuff that the game needs to remember, but they all work in different ways. So in Twine we set variables using the $ symbol. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to load up our Twine stories page. We've got normal day that we made before, but I'm just going to create a new one. I'm just going to call it day at college, right? So you play as a student who wakes up and they want to start their first day at college. So in here I'm gonna the story is going to be similar to the last one. So basically you wake up to the sound of your alarm buzzing. Okay, so you've got two options. You can hit snooze or you can get up. Okay, and if I hit the cross symbol here, we've got two options to progress with the story. But what I want to do in this case is to have a variable that tracks how many minutes late you currently are to college. So the way I'm going to do that is when you wake up, the game will say you are currently 0 minutes late to college at the start of the game, because obviously you've just woken up, so you're on time. But as we hit snooze constantly in the game, it's going to add to this value of 0, to make it so that every time you hit snooze, it adds 5. So you constantly, every time you hit that, it adds 5 to the how many minutes late you are. So if it wants, this will say you are currently 5 minutes late. So the way we do that is we set up a variable. So the way we set variables in Twine is we use a function. So a function is just basically some code that tells Twine that we want it to do something. So how we set variables in Twine is using the set function, which is typed out like this. So we use open bracket, the word set, a colon, and then the name of our variable. So remember, a variable, in order for Twine to recognize that we're talking about a variable, we need to begin it with a $ symbol. So we'll use set, and then the variable name, which I'm going to call minutes late. Okay, so I'm going to set that value. So you can either use the word to. So at the beginning of the game, I'll set that to 0. So no, I've used these open bracket and close bracket so that Twine knows that this is a line of code and not to print this out as text. And I've used the set function to set a variable called minutes late to the value of 0. This is its default value that I want to set it as. So if I just test this game out now, you'll see that it doesn't show up that text. It doesn't appear because I've told it it's in brackets, so it knows this is code, and this just happens in the background. So to use this value in the game, instead of putting 0, because obviously if I hit snooze and I add to this value, this isn't going to update because this is just like plain text that's just written there. So instead of putting the number 0, I'll use this variable name. So if I just copy that across and put that there, so it'll say you are currently minutes late to college. So instead of saying $ minutes late, because I've told it this is a variable that has a value with the $ symbol, so Twine knows it's a variable because it's different color. It will go, right, what is the value of this variable, and it will display that instead. So at the start of our game, we set this to 0. So just as an example, I'll set it to 10 to begin with, and then run the game, and it should just come up with saying that you wake up to the sound of your alarm buzzing, you are currently 10 minutes late to college. Yeah, so it's working. So instead of saying the number 10, it's recognizing that this is a variable, checking what the value of that variable has been set to, and then just printing that value. So that's how we can set variables. One thing just to note about variables is that you want to name these something specific that you are going to remember and understand and recognize later on in the game, because when you get a game with lots of different variables that do lots of different things, you need to remember specifically what that variable does. So in Twine, variables can't have space names, but you can spaces in them rather. But you can use an underscore. So you could have minutes late like that, but you couldn't have that because it wouldn't recognize it, wouldn't understand it. You can have numbers if you want, but minutes late is a good name because obviously it just means how many minutes late you are to college in the game. So, and as I've said, you can use the equal symbol instead of to. Twine has sometimes have multiple ways of doing things, but you just use whichever method works for you. So the way we can manipulate and change this variable, this value, is done in very much the same way. We use the set function. We say, so at the start of the game, we set this to a default value of 0. And then when we hit snooze, we want to add to that value. So in here, as for the story, I'll just put you want 5 more minutes of sleep, and then I'll just put in here hit snooze. But because I want it to go back to the start, I'll add in the this symbol and then start like I showed you in the last video. So now if I close that off, it will go back to the start. So when you hit snooze, it just goes back to the start of the game as it did in our other example. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add in a line of code which is exactly the same. So set minutes late, and then what I'm going to use is an example of arithmetic. So arithmetic sounds like a scary word, but it's maths related, and all it just means is basic mathematical functions. So this is addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication. So what I want to do is I want to add to this value, this variable. I want to add to it. So this is an example of basic arithmetic. So typically when people are starting out to write code like this, they would say something like set minutes late to, and then they'd go minutes late plus 5. So the game would go, okay, set minutes late, the value of minutes late is 0, so set that to 0 plus 5, which would be 5. So set the value of minutes late to 5. Obviously this is quite a long way of writing it out. So the quicker way of doing it would be to just say set minutes late, and then use plus equals and then what you want to add to it. So it's just a shorthand way of writing set minutes late to itself plus 5. We say set minutes late plus equals 5. Okay. The reason we say plus equals and not plus 5 is because when you type that out, so when it was written like that, it will just read that as what the total value is. So if minutes plus 5 would be equal to 5, so it would read that as set 0, so set minutes late to 5, yeah. But if I wrote that, it would think I'm saying set 5, because minutes late is 0 plus 5. So it would just read that as set 5, which wouldn't make any sense. But if I put an equals there, plus equals, it's saying, okay, add 5 to the current value of minutes late. So one thing that we need to do before this will work and function properly, so you'll notice that if I test this out, this isn't going to work, because I wake up to sound the alarm buzzing. I'm currently 0 minutes late to college. Hit snooze. You want 5 more minutes of sleep. Hit snooze. You are currently 5. Oh, it has worked. Okay, so it's updated this value of minutes late to college. But if I hit snooze again and then go back, and then it's added to it. I figured it wouldn't work because when you return to this, oh, that's why. Right. Okay. So basically, here I've gone right. Set minutes underscore late to 0, and then I've then started using minutes late without an underscore. So it's important to remember in Twine that you need to spell your variables exactly the same every time. So the reason it still worked even though it was using a different value is because the default value for a variable in Twine is going to be 0. So if I didn't set it, or I forgot to set a variable, the value of a variable, it will just give it a default value of 0. Sometimes game engines will go, well, you haven't given me a default value, so I'm just going to crash. Whereas Twine will just go, oh, there's no default value for this function, this variable, so I'm just going to set it to 0. So what happened there was it's gone, right, you wake up to the sound alarm buzzing, minutes late. There's no default value for this because I didn't set it here. I actually set minutes underscore late. So then it's added to that each time in here. What I was expecting to happen was I've said, right, the default value of minutes late is 0. So then if I test this out now, so I set that to 0 at the start of the passage. I'm currently 0 minutes late. I hit snooze. I'm 5 more minutes of sleep. Hit snooze. It's still 0. And the reason for that is because the game will, when it returns to this passage, it will execute this line of code still, even though I don't want it to. Set minutes late to 0. It'll just do that every time. So even though by the end of this passage, it will have added 5 onto that value, when I return to this one, it's going to set it back to 0. So one way to get around that would be to just get rid of this, and then it would default that to 0 at the start of the game, but then I haven't set it back to 0 at the when I re-enter this passage, so it'll keep adding to that. But something that's probably good practice is to, I'm just going to change the name of this to wake. I think when you do that, it changes any passage that references that passage automatically. So this was start, it's now changed to wake, and I'm going to create a new passage called start, and this is where I'm going to set all my default variables. So in here I'm going to say set minutes late to 0 at the start, and then give the player the option to start game, which will take them to the wake passage. Okay, so now I set my variables at this passage, and then when I go to here, it's not gonna matter that I return to this one, because it's being set in a previous one. So just to make sure this is working okay, so I click start game. You wake up to sound your alarm buzzing. You're currently 0 minutes late to college. Hit snooze. You want 5 more minutes of sleep. I'll hit snooze again, and then it's added 5 onto that. Okay, so every time I hit snooze, so I could do this as many times as I want, it will continue to add 5 onto that value. You can also do this with string type variables. So I'll show you an example of the use of a string variable. So remember before we talked about integers and Booleans and string variables. So this would be an example of an integer, because it is a number that's a whole number. So 0 is a whole number, 1, 2, 3. It adds on 5 each time. It doesn't add on 5 point something or other. So it's an integer. So to show an example of setting a string, I'm going to set a new variable called player name, and I'm going to set that to, and then the way you set a string variable is that you have to use quotation marks. So whatever inside here will be the value. So at the minute it's empty, but I can type in any text into this, and it will read that value with that variable. So if I put in here Stuart, just for an example, so set player name to Stuart. So whenever I reference this variable now later on in the game, so I can say you are currently like, I don't know, I'll put something like your name is, and then player name. You wake up to the sound of your alarm buzzing. So at the start of the game, it's going to set that player name to the string of Stuart, and then it's going to print that text whenever I play the game. So let's just test that out quickly. Start game. Your name is Stuart. So you could make this work where maybe you have an option where it says, oh, is your name Dave or John or Suzanne, and then from that it'll branch off, and then in each one you could set player name to whichever one they chose, and then the story can progress from there. But every time you reference player name, it's going to be the choice the player made earlier on in the game. That about wraps it up for basic variable stuff. A couple of things that I want to mention that I forgot to mention in the initial basics video, because everything is saved in your browser when you're using the browser version of Twine. Obviously don't erase your data, or you will lose your game data as well. The other important thing to remember is that we're using Twine 2.0. So if I just head to twinery.org, you can see here that the version that it is 2.1.3. There is an older version of Twine which is 1.4. The reason that I'm saying this is important is because when you are say you're Googling for a specific thing that you're trying to do in Twine, it's important that you specify that you are trying to do it in Twine 2, because they function very differently. The other thing that you need to be aware of, although at this stage it's not really that important, is that Twine has different formats. So what I mean, so here, if we look at this, it says change story format. So if I select that, you can see Harlow is the default one that I'm using, but there's other ones called Snowman and Sugar Cube. So basically, this just means that they have different syntax and different documentation. I would just keep it as Harlow for now, and just be aware that if you are looking for how to do specific things, you want to know how to do it in Twine 2 version 2 in the Harlow format. Because if you look, Sugar Cube has different sort of syntax for functions and things like that. So if I look up some macros, they're written out differently. So in our example, we used the set function. So notice now what I've done is I've changed to the other story format. If I try and play the game now, it will possibly return some errors because the story format is different. So you see here it's set differently. So you'll also notice that visually it looks different. So it's got saves and restart. It's got this panel on the left that you can get moving in and out. The default style of text has changed, but also these now the code that I've written is not recognized as code because I'm using a different story format. But I can just change back to Harlow, and then that will go back. But you can, if you want, look into those different story formats, but I would recommend as a beginner just playing around with the Harlow format for now. The last thing to say is that to test your games out, you want to be using Chrome ideally. I have had issues in the past where you try and do it in the new Microsoft Edge, I think it's called, where when you try and play your game, it just doesn't work, doesn't show up anything. But typically Chrome is usually pretty good. That's everything that I wanted to go through with this one. Next time we'll be looking at if statements, so how else we can use our variables in our game. All right, thanks for watching.